Hey there, Clean Freaks. As Brett said, we want to welcome you to this Lost in Space event. I'm thrilled to be kicking off this very first session of the morning today to kind of orient you to what life in space is really like, or at least life in the instrument space, because we're going to be talking about missing instruments, obviously, for every session today. But I want to try to bust some myths or at least reorient your mind around how you think about how this inventory moves through the sterilization process and the SPD workflow. So, we're going to spend some time talking about some things that you've probably thought about before, but maybe not in the context that we're going to be bringing them out in this session today. I'd love to hear what you think along the way. You can put any questions or comments in the Q&A tab, as Brett probably mentioned in the intro here. But if we don't get to questions during this session, I'll follow up um, after the event and I'll answer any questions or, potentially provide some insights and some feedback on some of your thoughts in either future sessions that we do or podcast or maybe some articles out there on LinkedIn. All right. Without further ado, are you ready to get to the whole reason that you woke up early this morning to join us? Lost in Space. Okay, here we go. So, as Brett mentioned, and as you probably know by now, since you registered, the name of this first session is Mayos are from Mars, Vascular clamps are from Venus, a journey into the inventory universe. Now, what are the objectives that we want to cover today? The three things that I want you to know from walking away from this session. Number one, we're going to orient ourselves, like I said, to this storage system, solar system, the solar storage system, as we call it today, to keep with the astronaut theme. Uh, and I'll explain a little bit more about what that is here in a moment. We'll spend a little bit of time on the human factor of this. We're actually going to cover similar questions in the next session in our panel discussion here. We'll talk a little bit more about human factors, but I want to talk about the astronauts versus the astrogots. And I'll explain that as well when we get to it. And then finally, we'll wrap with a conversation on how to sustain change. And this is not just going to be for this session. This is going to be important for every session that you listen to or that you view today or whenever you're viewing it as a part of this Lost in Space event. Because obviously, we want you to have a good time. We want you to learn along the way, but we want you to go back, make the changes in your sterile processing operating room, data space, wherever the changes have to happen. We want you to make them and we want you to keep them. So I'm going to cover a really fundamental approach to what I think has been very successful in my past career in sterile processing for sustaining change. So those are the objectives. That's what I want you to know by the time we get done. And if we check off all those boxes, then it'll be a success. So what is this solar system of storage? Um, as we know, inventory in SPD can go at light speed. These things can move through our departments very, very quickly. Sometimes, other times, it's kind of like a black hole. An instrument would come in to SPD in one of many different scenarios. We'll speak about that here in a moment. It can come in and never leave, kind of like Hotel California, right? You check in, but you don't check out. Well, that can happen sometimes with instrumentation and devices and entire trays in SPD. All kinds of ins and outs and speeds happen in this solar storage system in our department. So, the purpose of that quote here is really in the subtext. Our inventory is not stationary. So we call things storage areas, and we'll say it'll be like terminal storage, it'll be sterile storage, it'll be backup storage. We'll talk a lot about that in this session as well as some of the other sessions that happen today. But the point is, even when the inventory is not moving, it's not really safe from either being moved, so something acting upon it to move it from where it was to a new place. And it's also not safe from being lost. Obviously, the goal for this entire day is to address this missing instrument problem. And so, right at the outset, we've got to come to terms with, and we've got to let administrators and vendors and solution providers all around us really come to terms with our inventory is not sitting there for long periods of time. And even if it is, again, it's not safe from being impacted or moved by either our team or even others outside of our departments as well. And I'll comment on that here in a moment as well. So, if you're familiar with the presentation that I gave a probably about a year and a half ago now on backup inventory, we spent a fair amount of time on that session uh, uh, talking about how the replacement inventory is stored. I actually just published a blog about this a day or two ago on LinkedIn. You might have missed that. You can check that out if you're interested in more of that conversation. And if you've never had a chance to tune in to the backup Terry presentation that I'm referring to, I'm going to outline that real briefly here, and then we'll jump into more of the new material for this particular presentation. But, the backup area has a huge impact on this missing instrument conversation. A lot of the instruments involved with what we're trying to do, right? We're trying to keep our trace complete. A a lot of the inventory and instrumentation that's going to help us do that should be and hopefully is in this replacement inventory location. And that can be known by many different names. And I have many of those names listed here on the screen. So, some departments call it the pegboard, some call it replacement bins. The backup area, that's typically kind of what we have called it in many of my departments. Some even call it the graveyard. And I think we know why it can be called that sometimes. It is where instruments and missing instruments go to die, to never be found again. Or maybe it's where technicians go and they're searching so long for the replacement, they die and then they end up getting buried back there in the graveyard. It's also known as the wall sometimes, or just extras. And, extras is an interesting name for this place that we're talking about, that hundreds, if not over 1,000 instruments sometimes could be stored in this one location. If it's a bin system, if it's a pegboard, if it's a combination of all of those, there's debate in the industry and there's good presentations. We may even add a presentation here soon on what's the best way to store to be compliant around dust and other things that can impact this replacement storage, but we won't get into that today. But extras is one of the inventory types that end up on this wall or in the backup area on the pegboard. And the question that you kind of got to ask yourself when you refer to that, whether or not you call the replacement area the extras or not, it's true and then it's not true. Some of these are extra instruments that shouldn't be in a particular tray that you're processing, but they're not necessarily extra to the inventory. Likely, if they came back in a tray and they're not needed for that particular tray, they're needed somewhere. So they're extra for that tray, but they're not additional inventory that's not needed in process, right? They're likely to be pill packed, or they likely belong to another tray that was maybe used in the same procedure, but came through at a different time through decontam, etc. All right, so that's just the backup wall. Now we're going to go through quickly a number of different other areas where our inventory is not stationary. Again, because the whole purpose of this slide is to get you thinking that, hey, if you were to just high level say, where is our inventory at? It's, we store it in our sterile storage. Maybe it's in the OR. but maybe there's some in the OR. And then, besides that, it's kind of in process. But, there's not a lot of places it could be. It could be in decontam, it could be on the assembly side, it could be in sterile storage, or it's in the OR, right? Well, uh, let's think through that and let's talk through that here for the next couple of minutes. Um, Sterile storage is one place that it could be. And that sterile storage could be in your SPD. Your instrumentation, your inventory could also be in sterile storage, but not necessarily under your control or under your supervision. It could be stored in the operating room, right? Still sterile storage, but actually two very different places with different dynamics and different control and different impact and different accountability. It could be sterile storage in a controlled environment, as I kind of reference. And this could be true in SPD or OR, right? Like there may be more control in some sterile storage in the operating room. It may be more restricted access behind more red lines, more locked doors. But it could also be stored, inventory could be stored in sterile storage that's not as controlled. And I say uncontrolled. Now, by that, I don't necessarily mean unrestricted, because your sterile storage, by definition in the guidelines, is to be restricted access behind the red line. You need PPE. You need correct clearance to be in that area, or you should, right? But we all know, and we've probably all seen scenarios that our sterile storage is in an uncontrolled environment where there's people coming in and out or even passing through, that if we had it our way, we wouldn't want them there because they do not allow us to control that inventory in the way that we want and in the way that we know is best practice. Then we've got unsterile storage in SPD. So these are devices many times that maybe trays are being built by your instrument coordinator. They're new trays. Maybe they're waiting on instrumentation. Maybe there's trays even that are waiting on repair and replacement. And so these devices are being stored, but they're not sterile, right? So they're in SPD somewhere, unsterile and stored. Eh, We've got the out of commission trays in inventory. So, sometimes it can be similar trays to what I just mentioned. Maybe they're in the instrument coordinator's office. But in my mind, when I talk about out of commission, these things are not coming back anytime soon, right? Maybe they're taken down completely because Dr. So and so left, and that was Dr. So and so's, special tray. Or there's any number of scenarios that a tray would be down for the count. It's not expected on any preference cards. It's not on any priority list. No one's going to be pulling it to get it into sterile storage so it's ready for anything. So this thing's out of commission, but it's inventory that's still in the hospital. It's still an SPD. It can still be accessed. So that's why it's ending up on this list. Then we have instrumentation, obviously, that could be pending sterilization. So these are things that have been packaged. They're ready to go into the sterilizer, but they have not been sterilized yet. This is one of the highest risked stages of inventory in everything that we've been describing so far. And we all know why. If something is pending sterilization, many times, if you're not looking closely, especially by clinicians outside of SPD, that they're not trained to look at the sterility assurance markers in the way that we are. They should be. All of our nurses, all of our ED techs, all, all of the wound care clinic nurses, the respiratory therapists, everyone should have some core competencies about what a device looks like if it's been through exposure to sterilant and when it's not. But we know it happens, and we know from the news that it happens. So this pending sterilization stage of our inventory is really, really dangerous. And this is one of those things, again, if you look on the bottom left, even when our inventory isn't moving, it may not be safe. And this is safe from one of those things that outsiders come in, pull trays that have not been sterilized, or even sometimes our staff, confusing the stage of this inventory, could treat this inventory as potentially already sterilized instead of pending sterilization. Uh, Of course, we have inventory sometimes that's in the stage of pending assembly. So these are devices that have been cleaned, manual cleaned, mechanically cleaned. They've come out of the washer. They've maybe gone through the pass-through window if they're hand washed, and they're sitting on the side, pending someone to assemble and inspect them and package them. Okay. Then we have devices even farther back in the workflow that are pending decontamination. So these are devices that have been scanned into the decontamination process, but the decontamination process hasn't started for them yet. Um, and they're likely sitting either still in the case cart, or maybe they've kind of been broken out on top of the case cart. Maybe they're sitting on tables to decontam. Maybe they're sitting on the side of the sinks, but that's inventory, stationary, and yet still in process. And it should go one way through the process. We know through all of these examples, the inventory may not go in that linear progression. And I'll talk a little bit more about what I mean by that in a second. Then, of course, prior to decontamination, we've got this whole stage. This is a pretty long stage sometimes, could be hours that instruments are in use, anywhere from 20, 30-minute procedure all the way to multi-hour procedure. These instruments are being used, picked up, placed on the back table, moved around, all kinds of which ways in the operative setting, in the OR. And this is where a lot of the inventory and the instrument migration tends to happen, obviously, is when the devices are being used because you have multiple trays, you have multiple pill packs being open, and then the big mix up begins. And then prior to instruments being used, after they come out of sterile storage to kind of go back around in the circle, uh, we've got instruments that are in transport. So by that, I do mean instruments that are actually moving. Okay, so these are instruments that are being pushed by someone in a case cart up to the OR, or pulled by a little tugger machine if you've got those at your facility to pull multiple case carts at one time all the way to the OR, whatever that looks like for you. These are instruments that are literally moving. However, it also means instruments that are being stored somewhere on wheels. So these could be devices that have already been moved. Maybe they're outside of the OR room, maybe they're in the sterile core, maybe in the OR hallway, maybe they're kind of semi-permanent in the OR hallway. So this would be kind of emergency backup thing. Maybe some cabbages or some triple A carts that are out there. Maybe they're in the ED being stored in some kind of temporary case cart scenario. So it's not necessarily a non mobile storage, like a set sterile storage area, like what we mentioned in the beginning with the OR and the SPD, but it's also not unmobile, immovable. It, it's in a scenario that's very easy for it to be transported from the hallway to the room or from the room to another room, by chance. So that's the general flux in the dynamic nature of inventory that we see in SPD. However, there's also somewhere else, because even though those are all the places that I mentioned on this list, I'm sure you've already got in mind other places that instruments can end up on a regular basis in our solar storage system in SPD. And plus, there's these two big ones, right? And as we talk about missing instruments for the rest of the sessions today, uh, well, likely, the T word's going to come up a little bit: trash and being thrown away. The P word may come up a little bit as well. These things that end up in pockets. And that could be intentional. Um, Not necessarily for nefarious reasons, right? It could be, hey, this nurse needs these bandage scissors maybe for the rest of the day for some other non-sterile things, and so they don't necessarily think through the implications of taking that bandage scissor out of the set and putting it in their pocket. The same thing with the trash. I don't think anyone intentionally throws things away. I don't think anyone wakes up and says, "Hey, like this shouldn't be thrown away, but I'm going to throw it away anyways." But typically, the locations and the way that these instruments inventory end up in the trash is they either thought this instrument or device was disposable, or they didn't even know that it was getting thrown away. It was still stuck on a drape, such as a towel clip, or maybe gotten mixed up in some of the other disposable supplies that are being thrown away. So you can see now, right? So let me just go back here. It's a big list, a lot of different places. Intentional, unintentional, should be there, shouldn't be there, is in process from here to there, but in the meantime, it's going through another place in the solar system. And all of this means that along the way, it could get lost. It could go missing. Okay. Now the assumption, not to dog too much on consultants, because for many years, and I guess I still am, I was a sterile processing consultant my, myself. A lot of consultants, though, especially those coming from outside of SPD who've never worked directly in the chaos and complexity of the solar system that I'm describing, it can be easy to look at the sterile processing workflow and think it's linear. Instruments move from point A to point B to point C to point D, and then they do it all over again. Boom, 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 boom. It's like this line on the screen. That's the way that it goes. But we know, just as I described on the previous slide, even though maybe that example A is the goal, is the best case scenario, we know in reality that's just not how our inventory moves. That's not how the human factors impact it. That's not how the process impacts it. There's all kinds of complicating scenarios here, and I'll just throw out a couple that I know you'll be sitting over there saying, "Yeah, that's right, Hank. That's right. That's exactly what that little zigzag looks like on the bottom line." So let's say you get a device in to decontam, and you scan it in, and you realize, oh, okay, so this is priority. This tray out of the 5 trays in this case card are priority. So you take the proactive approach and say, well, I'm going to decontaminate this priority tray first, and I'm going to get that through the process. So boom, gets decontaminated, goes through the process, ends up on the clean side, and then someone starts assembling in it. Then what happens? They're missing instruments, right? Why? Well, potentially because those other 4 trays that are not the priority trays, they're not needed like that other one is. But in those 4 trays are the devices now that are missing from this tray that's already cleaned on the assembly side because it was a priority tray. So now your technician on the assembly side has 2 options. Number one, they can call back and say, hey, we need you now to expedite all 4 of those other trays because I don't know which tray these extra instruments are in. And so now you've got um, a 4 times priority on trays that are actually not priority, but they are now because they contain instruments that are part of a priority tray. So that's option number one for them. Option number two would say, well, now let me go back to the backup wall, to the extras, to the pegboard, and try to find the instruments that I need right now to complete my priority tray. This is one of those zigzags. So now you got instruments coming into the tray that weren't in the tray this morning, coming in off of the backup wall, and they're replaced. That tray is completed. It goes through the process into sterilization. And then those other four trays end up on your table. Now what happens? Now you've got extra instruments. And now those extra instruments need to be removed from that tray and returned to the backup inventory wall. That's part of the zigzags. Now, wherever you sit on the best practice or the best case scenario in what I just described, um, I'm not really getting at preference for one or the other there. What I'm getting at is the complexities of these devices are much more around and about. We're trying to move unidirectional through the workflow, to defend against cross contamination and everything else we want. But even moving unidirectional through the workflow, going from dirty to clean to sterile. Sometimes on your assembly table, and this is another example, you're confronted with a dirty instrument. Maybe it's a dirty Fraser suction. Now you're confronted with two scenarios. Number one, you take it back to decontam and say, hey, can you decontaminate this? And maybe they can do it right then with the manual decontamination. Maybe they need to ultrasonicate it. Maybe they want to send it through the washer as well. Um, or maybe they're so backed up, they're like, hey, I can get to that, but I got other priorities. It's going to be 10, 20 minutes before I can get it back to you. Either way, your other decision, again, going back up to the backup inventory wall that we mentioned, is to say, let me take this dirty Fraser suction back to decontam. They can do that whole process as they want to. I'm going to go replace it right now so I can continue the efficiency uh, of my assembly. And you got another twirl in this workflow because you're in that same scenario that I mentioned before. How you're going to have an extra Fraser suction eventually come out of decontamination that needs to be replaced and substituted back onto the backup wall. And this happens again and again and again. So the analogy that I like to use, and I used this a few months ago, got a lot of great feedback on this. So if you need to use it for any of your administrators, for any consultants, for any even maybe new technicians, or for customers in the operating room, especially surgeons who don't quite grasp what's going on here and why it's so hard to get these trays right every time. This is the analogy. We're not building a Ford F-150 truck, right? We're not building the same model truck all day long, every day, where we're just putting the same fender on. Got a box of fenders over here, and we're just fender, and grill, and seats. It's the same truck all day long. And like all of our workflow and everything is just built for these widgets, right? That's the manufacturing model. It's really specific. It's a, it's the assembly line. Everyone does their little small part of the puzzle. They put this weld here and they run this electrical line here, and then your side is the fenders. That's not what we're doing. We're not building the same truck every day, all day long for 365 days of the year. What we're building and what we're doing in the assembly process is we are putting together jigsaw puzzles, but not just jigsaw puzzles. We're putting together jigsaw puzzles of 100, 120 pieces. All the jigsaw uh, pieces are the same color. There's no photo on it. They're all silver. And what happens is before we get these jigsaw puzzles, we mix them all up. So you don't necessarily know until you actually sit down and start putting together the puzzle at that assembly stage if you're missing any pieces or if the pieces that you have are extra or if the pieces that you have are clean or dirty, right? And that's why we can't build our processes as tight and clean today as consultants may want them on the manufacturing side because we're not putting together a pickup truck in the same truck every single day. We're putting together all kinds of different puzzles because all kinds of different count sheets with all kinds of different pieces. They all look the same until we actually dump them out and start going through them according to the count sheet. And we can't tell what's missing until we actually get to that stage. So it's an extremely complex process that's not as easy as just streamlining it the way that some of these manufacturing consultants would have us to think. So use uh, that analogy if you want to uh, around the jigsaw puzzle piece and that complexity piece. I think that tends to wake some people up sometimes to understand this challenge a little better. All right. So we've spent a lot of time now just going through where could this inventory be? And all that list of different locations: controlled, uncontrolled, the OR, the SPD, in transit, uh, pending another stage, all these different places. We've just talked about how it doesn't move linearly. It's a dynamic path. It goes around and comes back. It's added in midway through. All of this gets us to where we want to get it, which is a complete tray that's sterile and functional and ready to go. But that doesn't necessarily answer the question on how all these pieces of inventory actually travel through this solar system that we're talking about, or how they travel through the space from decontamination through the entire process to the operator room to the patient and then back again. So, how does it travel? We're going to go through four different examples of the ways that our inventory travel. So, number one, it can travel naked and alone. All right. So, in this scenario, th- this would be the single instrument that's free floating out there, kind of like an astronaut in space, right? How scary is that? Just an astronaut out there, not tied to any spaceship. You're just floating out in space. Okay. So we got instruments that do that sometimes. That's how at different stages in the workflow, they're traveling without a tray, no packaging, no nothing. They're floating out there completely naked and completely alone. It could come from anywhere and they could belong to any tray. There's a lot of different ways that they get into that, right? Maybe they're brought in by a vendor. Maybe they're dropped off incorrectly by a clinic. Who knows how they get there? Maybe it's that Fraser suction that was taken back to decontam, that was in a tray, but by the time it comes out of decontam, it doesn't belong to that tray anymore because it's been replaced. So now it's naked and alone. All right. Our instruments could also travel naked and with friends. So this scenario is we got multiple instruments that are free floating out there in space. So think like a bunch of astronauts floating around, or maybe a better scenario that you've uh, potentially seen before is the skydivers, right? You got all these skydivers at one time that are doing the group skydive, and they're doing like uh, little combinations. They form a circle. It looks like they make a heart or whatever, but they're traveling together. Now, they're still not packaged in this scenario. They could still come from anywhere, they could belong to any tray. Although, if they're together already, chances are higher that they belong in the same solar system, right? It's likely that they were used on the same procedure. It's likely that either they belong to the same tray or they belong to the same family of trays. Maybe it's the main tray and the accessory tray that they came from, and in some combination, if you get them back into those trays, that's where they go. Okay, so that's naked with friends. Packaged and alone. Okay, great. So now we got instruments that have clothes on finally. All right. So this is single instruments that are contained, but they can still travel through space. Okay. Typically, these come from assembly, sterilization, or storage, and they belong somewhere, hopefully, either temporarily or permanently. Right. So these are packaged instruments that are supposed to be going somewhere. That's why they have a package. Almost always these days, if you're working with a tracking system, you get a complete account sheet and you get a label on your package. And that's going to be telling you where this package is supposed to be stored in sterile storage, right? Now, there are steps between then and actually getting in sterile storage, and there's steps, obviously, once it's taken out of sterile storage, because many times that label It only tells you where to put it in storage. It doesn't tell you, obviously, where it's going to go after it comes out of storage because it doesn't know yet. Is it going to go to room 7? Is it going to go to a clinic? Is it going to be pulled out of sterile storage and used in a tray as a replacement instrument? It doesn't know that yet, e- even though it has a package and a label on it. All it knows is, okay, now I'm clothed and now I'm supposed to go somewhere. And because of that, it can still and does travel in many different directions across our inventory. And then finally, our instruments in our inventory can travel through space packaged with friends. And obviously, this is the multi instruments contained together. So these are the trays. Sometime limited pill packs, if your pill pack is approved for multiple instruments, so you could have a couple of instruments in a single pill pack, depending on the IFU. You definitely can have multiple instruments in a wrap tray, in a container tray, even in some of these multi sterilization systems out there, multi tray sterilization. So there's a lot of different ways that these babies can be packaged and travel with their friends. So they come from the assembly stage, right? So these are the ones that are pending sterilization. So they're ready, they're packaged, they got their friends, but they're not sterile yet. They come from sterilization, so they're packaged, they're sterile, they're ready to go, but they're typically going into storage first before they go anywhere else. And then obviously, we've got a lot of these guys in our sterile storage area because that's what you see when you look around. You see all the trays and all the containers. These This is inventory that's been packaged with all their friends in the tray. So they belong somewhere specific, even if that somewhere it is temporary and not permanent. This goes into if you're processing trays, for instance, and and you're setting them for the emergency carts outside of the operating room that always stay there, but the inventory is kind of fluctuating through depending on how often it's being used. All right, so we've talked about how the inventory travels through space. We've talked about all the areas in space that it can travel, how it goes forward and backwards and all arounds at the same time. But let's talk a little bit about how this inventory is impacted by, we'll call them frenemies, because I feel like enemies was too strong of a word. Um, but these are people out there in the same solar system, same galaxy, that are impacting and coming across our inventory as it's traveling through space in the directions it should go, or maybe in the directions that we don't want it to go. But these are the kinds of folks that come across it, and it can do good for the inventory, can actually help the inventory get to where we want it to go. It can also do the opposite, and they can divert our inventory to go a different direction. And you can think about this if we want to continue the analogy of the solar system even more. A lot of these heavenly bodies, the moons and the stars and the planets, uh, they have gravitational pulls, especially the planets, obviously, because there's mass involved. Um, but there's gravitational pulls. And so if you get too close to a particular planet, let's say you're a comet or an asteroid, it will start pulling you. The gravity will start pulling you a little bit closer. It's going to change your flight path. So maybe the asteroid was headed toward Jupiter, but it got too close to another planet. And now it swerved off, and now it's going to be heading toward Venus instead, for instance. I apologize. My geography is not too good in space. uh, so, anyways, who are these frenemies that we're talking about? Let's just get into those here. Well, clearly, the number one frenemy to inventory and where it goes is us. And by us, I mean sterile processing. We're the ones many times that can pull inventory out of its charted course, out of the direction that it should go for reasons that are intentional and sometimes unintentional, as we mentioned before. A great example of this, and actually, this was in the blog I mentioned that came out earlier this week, talking about replacement inventory. But we know that at the end of shifts, when instrumentation um, has when all the inventory and all the trays have been assembled that can be assembled on that shift, and we oftentimes look around the department and we see all these extra instruments that are laying on tables and kind of on back shelves or over by the clean side unload of the washer. So you have all these free floating naked inventory. And we've got two options there right on the team. Do we replace that inventory or do we ignore it and hope someone else replaces it for us? And even if we do replace it, if we're told to replace it or voluntold to replace it, there's still a question on, are we taking the time and the effort, or do we even know where, even if we want to, can we effectively get this device, this variation, this product number in the right place that it should be on our backup wall in replacement? Are we putting the straight Mayo scissor in the straight Mayo scissor slot on the backup wall? Or are we putting it just quickly because it's time to go? I got to get home. I got things to do. Are you putting it on the curved Mayo slot? Not a big deal. It's kind of obvious, right? If you're looking for a straight Mayo and you pick up a curved one, this isn't right. Could be a big deal if whoever is inventorying your backup inventory is not looking closely enough at the variations. It says, oh, yeah, we've got plenty of curved Mayos because that slot's filled. But what they don't notice is they're filled with straight Mayos because every time someone's replacing these things, they're not looking very closely and they're just putting Mayo scissors up there wherever. All right, so that's one small example of how we can be a frenemy to our own inventory uh, process and really hurt our ability to not have missing instruments out of our trace because we're just undermining that replacement again and again and again. Vendors, all right. So easy one to throw under the bus. We can blame our vendors for diverting inventory. Now they're not as impactful on our extra and our backup inventory wall. They divert inventory more that is the stuff that they owned or they brought in. And they do it all kinds of different ways, going back to the storage scenarios that I mentioned before. If you've got a controlled sterile storage, or if you've got inventory that's in a case cart that's already been assigned to a particular room, but the vendor says, actually, no, I'm going to use those trays on a different patient today. And I just take them and they make that decision. And there's not a lot of communication sometimes between the vendor and SPD and the OR. And so no one knows where these trays have ended up, if they're ready, if they're still there. A lot of different scenarios that we can go through, we can talk through about that, but they definitely make the list of potential frenemies that can divert our inventory away from the goal that we intended for it in the processing workflow. And then finally, we started with us. So, yes, if SPD is our own frenemy, then vendors can definitely be frenemies. And we've got to include the OR staff in the list of frenemies for our inventory, specifically because of what we talked about before related to the T word and the P word, trash and pockets that tend to divert instruments out of trays that don't come back to sterile processing at all, but then also to that instrument migration in between trays, the mixing up of the jigsaw puzzles. Many times this happens in the operating room by the operating room staff. And just to spell it out, we're not saying that they're mixing up those puzzles intentionally, right? With a big smile saying, ha ha ha, ha SPD is going to love this. I'm mixing up 3 trays of 100 instruments. So now they got 300 different puzzle pieces to now figure out which puzzle they go to before they can even start trying to put the puzzle together. But we do got to be honest that many of the challenges around missing inventory have an intersection at some point in that cycle with the OR staff, and then, of course, with vendors, and then, of course, with us. Okay. We're going to go through the remaining slides on this presentation a little quicker than we have the first couple of ones, but I want to wrap here with the final two objectives. Okay. So we're going to talk now about astrogots versus astronauts. And as I mentioned, we're going to wrap with how to sustain a change as you finish the remaining sessions in this conference. And as you take away little ideas, little perspectives, I want you to be able to take away and hardwire that change in your department. So, what do I mean by astrogots versus astronauts? Um, an astrogot, and you can see the little smiley face, so we're going to like the astrogots. These are staff members who take a proactive interest in pursuing complete surgical trays during the entire reprocessing workflow. Or to state it another way, these are astronauts that are proactively searching the entire solar system of storage. Every area that we listed at the beginning of this presentation that an instrument could be or could go or could be found, these astrogots are saying it's my responsibility as an astrogot to look, to find, and to be proactive in thinking critically and creatively about how devices get lost, where they get lost, why they get lost, and searching for them in ways that perhaps I can prevent them getting lost or going missing completely. Or if they do get lost and are missing, I'm going to take a proactive and critical thinking approach to trying to locate them. It's kind of like a search and rescue. But the key word here is proactive. So with an astrogot, you don't have to tell this technician to go find this or go look and go try to figure this out. These folks, whether they're born or they're made, and I think there could be arguments, both ways. I think some of this is a personality trait. I do think other parts of creating astrogots can be trained if you're really approaching this with a proactive training model with your preceptors to create folks that are intentionally proactive and looking for instrumentation. But either way, they're going out there. If it comes across their radar screen, they know this missing instrument is going to be a problem, and I'm going to be the one to try to solve it. All right, so you probably know by now the opposite of an astrogot is an astronaut. And again, just to state the obvious, these are staff members who take an unengaged or a path of least resistance to completing their surgical trays through the entire reprocessing workflow. And this can play out in all kinds of different scenarios. Like an astronaut could be in decontamination, and they could be just really careless and really thoughtless in how they decontaminate trays or how they keep trays together through that decontamination process, which could lead to situations of more missing instruments and more swirls in that workflow diagram that I mentioned. They're not looking to be proactive or to go above and beyond. Uh, if they come across a missing instrument or an incomplete tray, they try to find the easiest way possible to either complete the tray or to get the tray off their table and let someone else deal with the problem. Um, and again, this is not just happening at the assembly stage. This can happen with how they treat pill packs, how they treat sterile returns, um, replacing things in inventory, how if they're doing first in, first out, how they're transporting case carts, how they're restocking the OR sterile storage. There's a lot of implications for these astronauts on the core issue here that we're talking about, which is missing instruments. So, do you want an astrogot or an astronaut in your department? I think everyone wants these astrogots. Um, and because, as I said on the previous slide, because there's probably a combination of personality and training that comes into place, The best way to end up with a department of astrogots is to be really, really thoughtful and intentional about how you interview and how you hire, seeking to get at this attention to detail piece. And I'm going to go through that um, at this stage, right? So you should be thinking about hiring, training, encouraging, recognizing, shouting out, and promoting all of these attributes on the screen here. So you want to be hiring people who are self-motivated, asking questions about in their previous jobs or careers, how do they demonstrate that they were self-motivated? How do you demonstrate that you're a problem solver? If you see team players, because remember, solving all of these different scenarios is not just dependent on one person. It takes communication, it takes teamwork, it takes critical thinking, as I've mentioned a number of times. You got to be detail oriented, process oriented. You got to have a little bit of courage to ask questions sometimes, or even ask, for permission of, hey, I'm in the middle of this tray. I've looked on the backup instrument wall. I don't see it. Can I have permission to go to the OR and look in the trash, or can I go to the OR and look in their substerile? Right. You got to have that courage in this astrogot to be as proactive as you want to be with it. You got to have a desire to excel, to go above and beyond. As I said, you got to be customer oriented, really thinking about who am I serving and who am I disserving if I'm not going to be proactive, if I'm going to be an astronaut. Who am I going to impact? I'm going to impact my team members negatively. I'm going to impact my customers in the OR negatively. I'm ultimately going to impact the patient. And that's that final point there. You got to have people. You got to hire people. Got to promote people. You got to shout out and recognize people that are demonstrating patient focused attitudes and actions, all tied in to how they're managing your inventory and how they're proactively coming at the complexities and trying to solve these problems before they spiral into even bigger problems. So there's a couple of things here on the organization side that I want to highlight before we go into sustaining the change. Uh, a lot of what we're talking about today, and we're going to talk about in the remaining sessions in this conference, is count sheet data and the role that count sheet data plays in communicating to your staff what's missing and what you need to replace it with. Tying this and integrating this between your count sheets and your physical inventory, whether it's the replacement inventory, whether it's your sterile pill packs, whether it's your inventory uh, that's out of commission or maybe down in different areas that you could still potentially pull from to complete trays. Integrating all this in a way that your data talks to each other and the physical location so that you know what's there and what's not there is only going to help you equip these astrogots with the tools that they need to be successful. And then obviously, and this is kind of where I was kicking the consultants earlier, you want to tie whatever solutions it is, whatever approach you take to the real life process that your techs are encountering day in and day out, right? So if your layout of your backup inventory is chaotic, if it's just a pain to get all the way across the entire department or to go through multiple doors and what have you, or open all kinds of drawers because they're not labeled properly, you're actually telling your astrogots that we don't really care if you're an astrogot or an astronaut. It doesn't really matter to us if you're not taking the time and the effort that you should be taking to connect your processes with what's really happening in real life, with the challenges that your technicians are having and keeping track of the inventory to do good by the patient. All right. A couple of tips here, and then we'll wrap. How can you sustain the change? Get your arms around the complexity of the inventory, your replacement wall, your process, your controlled inventory, and your sterile storage, or whatever it is that you take away from this talk and say, you know what? Yeah, we do need to get a handle on how accessible our inventory is to our vendors. Maybe that's the takeaway. Or maybe the takeaway is, yeah, you know what? We need to think differently about how we replace our extra inventory back to the replacement wall. Or maybe how we handle dirty instruments that are going back to decontam in the process while the trays are waiting. Whatever that takeaway is, um, and the changes you make, you got to identify what that core issue is. And so let's just use the example of the dirty instrument return to decontam, right? So the issue is twofold in that scenario. We got a dirty instrument that's coming through to the clean side. That's not good. And then the other issue is when I take it back, now I've got a missing instrument out of my tray and I have to determine what do I do with it next. Uh, the why behind it is twofold again. Well, I guess maybe it's onefold. Is why was that instrument dirty in the first place? And I know there's been a lot of talk. We've done a lot of podcasts about this in the past. The one thing that I would really encourage, especially any new leaders listening to this today, the why is almost never a who. It's almost always a what. And even if there is a clear who, and you're like, Johnny, he just does not brush those Fraser suctions, and everyone knows Johnny doesn't do it. Okay, well, Johnny is a who, but the what is still, why doesn't Johnny brush? Has Johnny been engaged in all the educational activities that you've had around brushing? Have you done any specific brushing? Uh, is Johnny not even aware that we have the right size brush, right? So there's a lot of questions you should be asking that go beyond Johnny in into the what and the process piece, and not try to answer the why question with just a who. All right. So we ask the who. Now we brainstorm an improved process or policy. And this brainstorming piece is really critical, especially again for new leaders, but also established leaders. Let me just remind you, most of your great solutions for these challenges that we've been talking about today are not going to come from your big head as the sterile processing manager or director. They're going to come from the front lines, from the technicians out there that are doing this every single day. So include your staff, your frontline leaders, your educators, as many people as you can, even in the operating room, even your vendors, and say, hey, we've got this problem. Let's all sit down together and throw out some ideas, because many of these ideas may not be the solution to the problem that you're seeking to solve, but they could be solutions for other problems that folks haven't even addressed yet, or they could kind of lead you into more conversations that you could address to other problems across your workflow. So you only have um, you can only benefit positively by opening up this brainstorming to the entire team. Now, take the time and the steps that you need to develop education and signage necessary for the change. A lot of folks skip this step because they're like, okay, we brainstorm a solution, boom, now we got the new policy. And the new policy is brush all your Fraser suctions. Okay. And we're just going to tell Johnny, we're going to tell everyone else, y'all need to brush better. Well, you skipped the develop the education step. And if there's any signage necessary, maybe it is just kind of a short term sign. You say, hey, like for 3 months, we're going to have a little sign in the OR that reminds folks, or maybe even on the case card that reminds folks, hey, you should be flushing this in the OR at the point of use, your suctions. That way, when they get to decontam, we should be flushing them too. Maybe there's a sign that you put up there temporarily. Maybe it's a little pop up on your tracking system. Whatever it is, you got to develop that at this stage. Because if you skip over this and it's just another, well, we need to tell Johnny, you shouldn't be surprised when Johnny doesn't remember or doesn't do it again, because you didn't take the time, the effort that it requires to really sit down and to develop this. Then once you have the education and the signage, then you communicate the plan to the team. This is including not just your direct team that's going to be impacting the change. It's also including the operating room, the customers, the clinicians, anyone that's going to be impacted by the change. Now you communicate it. But wait, there's more. Then you schedule a go live date. A lot of folks, in trying to sustain change or implement change, they flip these and they go live. They get the idea, they do the education, they go live with it. And then they're like, okay, yeah, maybe now we should tell people what we're doing. um, Not a good scenario for sustaining change. You lose a lot of trust with your customers many times if they're like, what is this change and what just happened uh, to this? So I highly recommend getting the brainstorming done, getting the education and signage done, communicating to your team first, and then saying, as of April 1st, now we're going to start doing this new policy, this new procedure change. And then obviously, the final piece to this is audit the process. You've gone through everything, you brainstormed, you made signage, you educated, you set the go live date. The best way to sustain what you want, to get the outcome and the impact that you want of the change, small or large, is you got to audit. You got to go in there on a regular basis over weeks and months and sometimes even years and check and ensure that what you wanted that change to accomplish is actually happening. And if it's not, pivoting a little bit to make it happen, or completely starting the process over again and saying, okay, that didn't work the way that we wanted it to. So let's brainstorm some uh, new processes or solution to start the process again, and then go through all the education, all the communication, all the go live, and then audit that new solution to continue to sustain the change. All right. So I threw a lot at you here, mainly to set you up for what you're about to hear over the next 4 sessions today. But also, again, to get that takeaway and encourage you, if you felt like, man, this inventory like is way more complex than people give me credit for. We've got the tiger by the tail. Things are going every which direction. It's not as simple as just, well, let's improve our sterile storage or let's put barcodes on this. All those things are critically important. But your movement of your inventory is dynamic. It's not a simple location. It's not A to B. Instruments are going all over the place and they're traveling together in groups. They're traveling packaged and unpackaged. You got to have astrogots on your team if you want to get this right. And whatever changes you make to your data, to your physical inventory, to your training, whatever those changes are, you've got to be auditing in order to sustain that change. With that, I'm going to wrap it up. We went a couple of minutes over. I'll be right back with you for the next section, talking about a panel discussion that's going to dig in even deeper to this missing instrument challenge. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Brett.